Graham Potter has hit the ground running at Chelsea, and the big question on everyone's lips is his Chelsea better than Thomas Tuchel? So on the board in front of me, I've got a Chelsea hypothetical lineup here, and I think what we should start off by looking at is the fact that there are similarities between what Graham Potter is doing and what Thomas Tuchel is doing. So Thomas Tuchel set the team up in a certain way, and Graham Potter has used some of those ideas to actually build on as a foundation for his team. So the first thing to notice here is the structure. So we've got a 3-4-3 structure, and we call this a 3-4-3 box structure because in the midfield we have this box shape here. So usually in a 3-4-3 you would expect these attacking players to be maybe a little bit wider, but actually these players are going to come quite narrow, and what that does is this generates a lot of space in these wide areas here. And what you can do is you can get your wing backs into these sort of areas up alongside that narrow front three, and then you're in a really nice attacking situation. Now, Graham Potter and Thomas Tuchel have both used wing-backs in quite creative ways. You may remember last season, there were times when we actually saw Ruben Loftus-Cheek used as a wing-back here, with Reece James dropping in here. Now, the reason that this is done is that whenever you're playing a back three, you're essentially taking a player from further up the field and dropping them in between the two centre-backs to make this back three here. And so the big question is that when you're going forward, how do you reintroduce that player back into the mix so that you've got enough players in those advanced areas? The way that we saw it happen under Tuchel sometimes was that because you've got this narrow front three here, you can get Ruben Loftus-Cheek when you're in these attacking moments, pushing inside, inverting, as we say, just to help out in this attack. And this generates just a huge amount of space in this area here that Reece James can push it into. Your two centre-backs remaining can split, and you've pretty much now at a situational back four here. You've managed to push that player into an advanced area. So you've managed to reintroduce the player from the back three into the attacking mix. Now, we've seen similar things happening under Graham Potter, but actually on the other side of the pitch. So at times this season, we've actually seen players like Raheem Sterling, Christian Pulisic actually playing in this wing-back area. You may remember that first game that Graham Potter coached Chelsea under against Salzburg. We saw Sterling playing as a wing-back in that sense. And the reason why Potter is doing this is because he actually wants to generate space in these sorts of wide areas here so that he can get his creative players coming in. You can invert them, so get them coming in towards goal on their stronger foot and generating a lot of problems over there. So we're seeing inverted fullbacks, but in a different way under Potter. Another area that we're seeing similarities between these two managers is in the way that they're trying to build up the play style that they're using. So with this 3-4-3 structure, you're obviously going to see similar shapes in build-up, but also in terms of the style of build-up, both managers are wanting to do fairly patient build-up to maintain possession of the ball and get it into these sorts of areas where they've got their narrow front three, their wing-backs in advanced areas, the two centre midfielders pushed up, and then the back three here. So controlling the possession, moving it into this attacking situation, and then generating chances from there. And this is where you start seeing some of the differences emerge between the two coaches, because actually if we compare the attacking performances under Tuchel and Potter this season, we can start seeing that there are big differences between the two coaches. So we've just got the basic data from Chelsea's season so far, and we divided it into Thomas Tuchel's time and then Graham Potter's time. Sample size issues, only 7 games for Thomas Tuchel, 5 for Graham Potter, so take this with a pinch of salt. But if we look at the goals numbers, we can see that things were going much worse for Thomas Tuchel than Graham Potter, and actually that is supported by the underlying numbers as well, the expected goals for and the expected goals against. And interestingly, if we look at this final figure here, so expected goal difference per 90, we can see that when Thomas Tuchel was in charge, Chelsea would be expected to draw against most of their opponents because they're putting up the same chance quality as their opponent, whereas actually under Graham Potter, they're putting up about a goal better in terms of expected goals. So you'd expect them to win in those games as well. So big differences in terms of the underlying numbers. So why are Chelsea performing better in the short term under Potter than they were under Thomas Tuchel? Anecdotally, I had thought it was because when Thomas Tuchel was managing Chelsea by the end, they were really ponderous in possession. They didn't seem to be able to cause any problems in the final third, and a lot of their attacking chances were breaking down because of this. And so what I expected to see was that under Graham Potter, there was just a much quicker Chelsea there. They were going to be picking the ball up, moving the ball down the field quicker, and being able to exploit space that was left because of their speed. But when I looked at the data, it actually turned out to be very different. So Mark Carey made me one of his playstyle viz. On the y-axis here, we've got the speed of attacks. So the higher up you are in this direction, the quicker you are when you're attacking. And then on the x-axis at the bottom here, we've got passes per sequence. So the more passes you're making in possession, the further this way you'll be on the viz. And actually, you can see here we've got Graham Potter and Thomas Tuchel, and those 2 points are the wrong way round according to my anecdotal evidence. I thought that Graham Potter would be further up here because I thought that Chelsea would be playing a little bit quicker, but actually it's the other way round. Thomas Tuchel had Chelsea moving the ball down the pitch quicker, and Potter is a little bit slower in build-up. So what's going on here? So if we go back to the tactics board, I've got Chelsea in their attacking structure. So you've got your wing-backs high, you've got your narrow front three, you've got your centre midfielders behind them. And the big question then is, how are you going to break down teams? And under Thomas Tuchel, what we saw was a lot of ponderous passing. Once you got to this sort of situation, there was 2 options. You could either play the ball in here and try and get a player to head the ball or attack it at the back post, which is a bit of a risky option if you're a high possession team, because you don't want to needlessly give away possession, especially if you're not generating high quality chances. The other thing that we saw was a lot of passing, ponderous passing around the back, as Chelsea looked to find spaces in the middle to try and break down. Now, having watched all of Chelsea's games under Graham Potter so far this season, one of the things I've noticed is that in possession in the final third, what we're seeing is Chelsea actually being a lot more dynamic in the final third. So balls being passed and then the player who's passed moving. So you might see, for example, Reece James playing the ball into Sterling and then making a movement here. You will then see other players off the ball moving around. So lots of dynamic passing, lots of 1-2s, lots of first time passes. And as a result, it seems as though Chelsea are having much more joy in the attacking third. One example of this to show you, this is from the Milan Chelsea game in the Champions League at the San Siro. This is a situation where Chelsea have the ball, the defence are in a fairly decent defensive structure. We've got a really nice example of the setup here. So the 2 narrow forwards here, the centre forward here, and then your 2 wing backs on either side. So this is the sort of structure that Chelsea like to get into. Kovacic has the ball, he plays the ball first time into Mason Mount, and rather than holding the ball up, he actually plays a first time pass through to actually Sterling, but the ball goes in behind that defensive line, and then Aubameyang actually gets past Sterling and is able to finish into the bottom corner. And that's the sort of thing that we're seeing more and more happening under Graham Potter. We're seeing those quick passes and making the most of dynamism in the final third, and it's obviously having a big impact. Another area where we can see the differences between Thomas Tuchel and Graham Potter is in the way that they were using Mason Mount. Now, Mason Mount has been arguably the most important player for Graham Potter, and the reason for that is his tactical flexibility allows Potter to do lots of different things in different scenarios. So we have Mason Mount here in the left-hand side of this front three, and we've said this front three stays quite narrow. But what we saw in this game was that the role of Mason Mount was to actually generate space in the final third for a creative wing-back in Christian Pulisic. And he did this in 2 ways. So the first one was out of possession. So what we're seeing from Chelsea is we're going to have Havertz, the centre forward here between the 2 centre backs. We're going to see Conor Gallagher actually pulling out onto the fullback here. And Mason Mount, who you might expect to come out onto the fullback here, is actually going to pull inside, sit on the pivot player in the build-up. And then you've got the 2 centre midfielders able to trap the other 2 centre midfielders. And what that means is that Christian Pulisic then has to push right up onto this fullback. So he's almost playing as a wide forward. Actually, almost looks like a 4-2-3-1 in terms of the structure out of possession. But the reason why Mount is doing this is because by pulling inside here, by having Havertz here, what we're doing is we're generating a huge amount of area here so that Christian Pulisic can become 1v1 against a fullback, and you then would hope that he would be able to generate dangerous chances in those sorts of situations. So Mason Mount's position here, just drifting inside out of possession, allows Pulisic to get all of this space. Now, the other way that Mason Mount could generate space was in build-up. So with the build-up structure like this, what we are seeing a lot in the Premier League so far under Potter is Mason Mount just dropping in here and helping in these sorts of build-up moments. Now, the reason why this is helpful is because when Mount drops, you'll expect one of these players probably to track him to make sure that he can't get easy possession. And what this does again is it generates space in here, and Christian Pulisic can run into this space here and again generates all these sorts of problems here. Now, Mason Mount was used in a very different way in the Champions League games against Milan. So AC Milan's biggest threat are on the left-hand side. So they have Theo Hernandez, a left back, and Rafael Leao, who's a left forward. Both of them really exceptional ball carriers, both really athletic, and they can just drag players all over the place. They can get into central spaces, or they can overlap as well, and they can work in tandem as well. So when one goes inside, the other one will go outside, and they can just cause all kinds of problems in those games. Now, Graham Potter was aware of AC Milan's threat, and he approached the game quite differently to any of the other games so far in his tenure. We've already said that AC Milan are a very transitional team, and so rather than pressing high, which is what he has done in the Premier League, we saw something quite different. So we saw the front three dropping quite narrow here, and then rather than Mason Mount dropping inside as we saw in the Premier League, we're actually seeing coverage coming from these two central midfielders here. What they were doing then was they were allowing AC Milan to have possession of the ball and forcing them to then have to build up, not doing the transitional attacking that they love to do, but actually having to think about the way that they were building up. And they weren't able to do that particularly well, so what we saw was one of these midfielders dropping in to help out, so you're already losing a player in that central space. So for a team who are going to counter press and spring attacks, there's one fewer player in that area, and as a result of this, Milan really struggled in this game. Now, interestingly, in the first leg, Theo Hernandez didn't play, so there was a substitute player in this position, and interestingly enough, Mason Mount played out on the left-hand side of this front three. In the second leg, Theo Hernandez comes in, Mason Mount is brought across to this side and Sterling is moved across to the other side. So again, we're seeing Mason Mount actually provide a bit of tactical flexibility for Graham Potter. He can use him as an excellent player in out of possession systems. And when you have this really dangerous link up between these two players, you can then have players like Reece James, Mason Mount, Chalobah all just keeping their eye on these two players and stopping them from building up too much. Graham Potter has been able to take Mason Mount, identify his tactical flexibility and use him as a really important key in his team setup so that he can respond to opposition threats and make them much less dangerous. So is Graham Potter's Chelsea better than Thomas Tuchel's? Well, in the short term, it seems hard to argue against that because the underlying numbers are just so much better. But in the final third, we're seeing so many signs of improvement under Graham Potter that suggest that Chelsea are really well set up for future success.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Daniel Taylor, Ollie Kay, Amy Lawrence and Rafa Honigstein. There are journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.